talk about some of the Fed's decisions, and I know that you're a member of the Federal Reserve Advisory Committee.
Right.
I'm not quite sure what that actually means or what insights you have, so can you share about that?
Well, it's all a matter of public record, but I notice when I read the minutes, they seem awfully sanitized. We meet formally once every quarter for about 3 hours. There are a number of luminaries there. Ray Dalio is on the committee. Paul Tudor Jones. Any number of other people that are household names in investing, and then they have people like me, so they can get the common man's view of the world. In those discussions, there can be some pretty frank, comments made. It's interesting. In the last meeting, President Williams, toward the end of the meeting, said, before we adjourn, we usually have President Williams likes us to have 3 topics. And so we have an hour for each one. And so one of us, which, I get elected a fair amount, are there to present a deep dive on a topic. I just did the spike in Fed funds, right? But at the end of the meeting, President Williams looked around the table and he said, okay, before we go, he said, I just want to take a survey. I want to know how many people here, whether you think we're going into a recession or not. And it was interesting because pretty much as he went around the table, everybody was like, we're going into a recession. And, he was basically ready to adjourn. And he said, so it's unanimous, we're going into a recession. And I'm like, well, no. I mean, in my mind, the jury's out, right? And he said, well, why is that? And I said, look, there's an old adage, don't fight the Fed. And I think as investors, all of us around this table need to have more confidence in our government's willingness and ability to print money. Williams looked at me and said, Scott, he said, I think we've been pretty clear, right? We want continued expansion, maximum economic growth, and the lowest possible unemployment rate. He said, I think we're saying the same thing. But he said, when you say it, it sounds bad. And my response to John was, well, yes, but I said it sounds a lot more interesting the way I say it. So I think the message is clear. The Fed, after that meeting, if I wasn't convicted at that point that we're going to do everything we can to avoid a recession, but give the administration a chance.
So is the Fed really the only game in town, or do we need to step in with some more fiscal policy?
Well, we don't really have much room left on fiscal policy. I do think there are some things to be done. I had dinner with Art Laffer on Saturday, who's a good friend. And of course, Art never met a tax cut he didn't like. But I think if we were to have a payroll tax holiday, that would allow, the payroll tax is the most regressive of all taxes, that would allow lower income people to take home a bigger part of their paycheck, that would stimulate consumption, and you wouldn't have to necessarily make it structural. You could have it expire at the time you do it. So I think something like that would be very useful at this point. And but the other thing though is fiscal policy is sort of dead. A lot of the things that we need to do in this country to really increase productivity, we're not doing. And so somehow the basic tenets of macroeconomics have kind of slipped off the table, and nobody really talks much about them anymore. They talk about, the Green New Deal or MMT or, Medicare for all. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of those ideas have some elements of merit in them. But we're not really dealing with the underlying structure of the economy, which allows output to rise. And we're being constrained by the fact that the factors of production based on current policies are being restrained in terms of their growth, and that's what's really limiting the ability of the United States to grow.
It's interesting, if you watch the Fed balance sheet, of course it was declining and then it's spiking with the repo funding. It's not QE, but the market seems to think it is. At this trajectory, we're going to be way past, where we were, a few years ago. So what's your thought on that? Is it QE? Is it not QE? Is the market paying attention like it appears to be? And maybe what was the conclusion of your comments?
Sure. Well, I mean, I just spoke at Grant's conference in New York a couple weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to present my view with Bill Dudley, the former president, sitting in the audience in an unvarnished fashion. But you know, look, the dirty little secret around the spike in Fed funds is there's not enough money to finance the government. The deficit's too big. The settlement of the Treasury auction at the same date the tax receipts went to the Treasury just finally, you know, broke the back of the system, and we needed more liquidity. Now, it's funny because in the lead up to that, you know, you comment about me talking to people at the Fed. In the July meeting and the October meeting, I sat in the room and explained to them that, you know, I showed them data that I said, you know, I think you're being more restrictive than you think you are. You know, the combination of QT and raising the funds rate is showing up in a lot of metrics. Like, for instance, the spread between the Fed funds effective rate and the interest on excess overnight reserves, or what I like to call EOR. So, you know, as that, you know, they were clearly having a problem keeping the funds rate capped. And so finally, you know, we had the issues that I described, and it was the straw that broke the camel's back. So now the question, of course, which I really have a hard time with, because I think, I don't know why the Fed, I know why the Fed doesn't want to admit it, but, you know, I say to the Fed, you know, I think the program is formally known as large-scale asset purchases. I go, I think Treasury bills are assets, and it looks like it's large-scale, right? So I guess that's QE. Now, they get into this whole thing about, no, it's really not QE because it's short-term investments versus long-term investments, but yet these are the same people that I was talking to back when they launched QE1, and I said, look, why don't you concentrate the purchases of securities in long-duration treasuries and mortgages? And they said that would be manipulating the markets and trying to affect the term structure, which was the reason they weren't going to do it. I mean, we all know they ended up doing it with Operation Twist and all of this, but now they're defining it and saying, well, it's not QE because QE is manipulating the shape of the yield curve. Anyway, so just remember one thing at the end of the day. These people are civil servants, and they're working for the government, and these ultimately are political jobs. So they're very concerned about any kind of repercussions of being criticized for what they're currently doing. But I will say this, given the tools they have at hand, I think they're doing a fairly good job. And they do screw it up from time to time, which I think they did going into December. But at least this time around, they were quick to respond. They weren't so quick to respond when the housing crisis hit. Just remember one thing. The source of and solution to every financial crisis is the central bank.